Hello there. Welcome to an experimental podcast slash vodcast slash talkover where I will be running through the full process of dopping, faceting, all the fun stuff about cutting this gemstone. And you can see there I chose a dop very carefully by putting it up against the stone that I'm going to be using. And I'm using a hybrid wax superglue method to dop the stone. And I have this little ball of wax that I put on a big dop and then line up the stone underneath my target dop. And I'm going to get it eyeball close here since this isn't super precious material. I'm not too worried about getting the perfect yield from it. But you squish it down into the wax so it stays still, and then I use an alcohol lamp to I use green wax for my dopping, and I'm going to heat both the dop stick and the wax at the same time. And this way it creates a little bit better of a seal with the stick or with the dop. And I need to get it so that the wax is just flowing so it moves a little bit and I can deform it, but not so flowy that it just drips off the dop. There's a little bit of a fine line there, and of course it's all just off screen. So now that I have all the wax that I need on the dop, I'm putting it back over the flame to homogenize everything, more or less, make it one solid block of wax rather than old wax and new wax tacked on. And what we'll be cutting is a design that I'll be showing in a few minutes here, where we're going to design the whole thing in GemCut Studio from start to finish. Once we get that, you can see it deformed just a little bit there as I pressed it down. You don't want to press too hard because then it could move the stone in the wax and ruin your targeting. And I use super glue. I've used this super glue bottle now for almost 2 years. Over a year and a half at least. It's still going strong, but the top doesn't fit on it anymore, so I have to use a toothpick. And it takes a little bit of time to get the glue to come down into the cone. I tried to show where it was with a light behind it, but of course that was also off frame. I'll have to get a new one here soon enough. But it was $6 well spent. And I use, maybe too much glue for some people, but it works most of the time. The only stones that I have trouble keeping on the dop are my very small, 2 millimeter dop. Those ones are hit and miss whether they're going to stay on or not anyway. So I've got the super glue. I press down the wax, and I think at this point I was like, oh, maybe it's just a little bit off center, so I fixed it a little bit or made it worse. I don't know. The original diameter of that rod was 9.8 millimeters or so, and I wound up with a 9 millimeter stone. And I use Instaset to set at least the edge of the super glue there, so I can work with it right away. And all I use is just a drop from the tube rather than spray, because there's just way too much overspray, and that stuff volatilizes and is a lung hazard long term. But now it's pretty much secure, and I could go over and facet it, although I think I took a break for an hour to do some errands while this was setting up a little more firmly. But I don't have to wait overnight, so that's what I look forward to. And now here we are in GemCut Studio. We've got our index gear, starting with a 96 index gear, because that's what I use, and we can do symmetry and mirror to create lots of different shapes. Everything starts with a cube shape by default and 1.54 refractive index, so I'm going to design for my neodymium YAG, or just YAG in general. I have some custom made ones that were provided by Arya Akvan, in a Discord, and so that gives me a better idea of what YAG will be. Although it starts out, you can see the red blob there as I put in some facets, and I'm doing a 12-fold symmetry here. The corners of that cube start to turn yellow because that's what the default YAG color is. So I'm just going to go in and design the girdle facets there, just simple 12-sided design, roundish. And then I want to put in some crown facets at 37 degrees, sure. Put those in there so then we can see on the bottom there the renderer showing it in a yellowish with the red is the window color, meaning that the light is passing through the stone. And so I want to change that to look more like what my YAG will look like, which is kind of a very light pink to purple depending on the light, but light pink is a good way to design it. And we have a gemstone already, but we need to make it a little more interesting and get rid of a lot of that windowing. So I'm just kind of throwing things out there, kind of keeping a 12-fold symmetry. So it's a 6-fold symmetry now, but mirrored twice. So it's kind of like, I figured 12 facets would reach the girdle there if I went down to a lower angle. And lo and behold, it makes that kind of snowflake pattern. And then I'm counting the interior things there, but going like, oh, how many are there now? Is it still 12? It's like, so there's 4 and 4, which is 16. Not quite the same, whatever. But it looks like that. 39 degrees. I think I thought it looked just a little bit weird. And so I'm trying to figure out the math of what would work better. And 4-fold symmetry with an index of 8 mirror, and that means that the facets are 8 indexes apart. And I guess that's a factor of 12, so that works. For a crown, very simple. You don't want to do too complicated because then it's kind of a pain to facet. And for the crown, I started off with my 37, but maybe I don't want that to be 37. Or no, I am making it 37. Who knows what I'm doing here? So I have a 29-degree angle that I just put in there at the same symmetry as the last index on the bottom. And I'm keeping those angles the same, but lowering it to kind of make it looks kind of like a fisheye effect almost. But I want to make those interior facets, I'm going to do the break facets now and go back to an 8-fold symmetry here and put a table in. And it looked kind of weird at first. I could probably extend those 4 break facets that don't have any meets to go to the next meet point area there, but I'm okay with some floating facets. And this is the performance. You can see the brightness, it's relatively bright, over 80%, but there's a bit of windowing, like 20% more or less. And so I'm going to just go to manual optimizer, and this is the starting where I just did it. So it's 100% of the crown and 100% of the pavilion. And if we go up or down, left and right, then that changes the crown index, the angles of the crown and the pavilion. So if I make made the crown, 10% shallower and the pavilion 10% shallower, then it yielded this, which has a lot less windowing. And so I'm just going to go with that and round off my numbers to the nearest degree, because I don't really need to do 30. What is that? I don't need 26.51. I can do 26.5. It's all the same, basically. And so we're just cleaning it up, and then we'll have to figure out a name for it. And I think what I thought when I was naming it was it's kind of like a compass if it's rotated about 45 degrees with the north, east, south, and west, and then sort of the minor directions and the stubby little arrows. So I figured I would call it news for north, east, west, and south. But we can run through the cutting assistant just to see how things will go, and we'll cutting the girdle is fast, so we'll just cut all those in at once. But we can go facet by facet here just to preview it and say, oh yeah, we got to go to a center point here for that first tier. And then we cut down to the girdle for the next tier, make a new center point, and then this one will cut down to those meets there. So very straightforward. On the crown side, we cut to a new center point, and by leveling the girdle here to our desired thickness, and then the new facets cut down to the girdle then on the second one, and then those ones meet C2 and C1. And then that one, some of those are going to be floating in, so they don't have meets. But the other ones you can judge based on how far you cut in that to the other meets there. So it's a little bit loosey-goosey in some ways, but not bad overall. And I realized I had to rotate that to be, up and down and east and west in order to make sense both visually and also by design standards. You want it to be symmetrical reflection. So there's the printout of what I'll be cutting here. You can pause it and use that to your heart's content. It's an okay stone. And we'll print it, and then we can go back and get started cutting. And here is my faceting machine setup. I already put it in the Raytech Shaw handpiece. And I'm going to start out with I think it's a 360. I don't know what you'd call that. It's kind of like a sintered disc, but it's got some channels in it, but I don't think it's a channel disc. And I think it's a 360, but the label was worn off, but it's definitely finer than a 100 grit disc. So it's either a 180 or a 360, but it cuts pretty well and leaves a really nice finish actually for the coarseness of the lap that it is. I think because it's relatively worn in. But I'm checking that my cheater was zeroed because I had it offset from my previous stone. So you gotta remember to do that before you start. And just getting the angle set up to cut those first facets at 42 degrees or whatever they were, 45. And this is going to be the screen for the next 2 hours, whatever it is that we have remaining. And because I just started with a very relatively big stone, it's kind of, it's longer than it is wide. I was worried about, fulcrum pressure and all that stuff. So I decided to hold the stone while I rotated it. And what I'm doing with my thumb that's just out of frame on the left side of the screen here is rotating the lily pad or whatever you call it to lower it gradually. And so I'm cutting by ear basically, where once the grinding starts going away, I can lower the stone more and cut away more and more. And this is probably, not super exciting. So what else do you got going on? Have you faceted before? Or are you just watching someone do this? I'm always curious. I'm not very good at vamping. But we're going to keep going because that's what this is going to be. We're 15 minutes in and I'm already losing steam. And I'm also kind of losing patience with the stone at this point because I'm a relatively impatient cutter. I'm more a fan of either small stones or, getting things done quick. And for faceting, that's not always they don't always go hand in hand. Because you have to take your time. And I'm good at details, but not necessarily patience. So I'd rather do things quick but accurately, which is sometimes anathema to the desired effect. But anyway, I think this is the 113th stone that I've cut on this machine. More or less. I think there might be a couple small ones that I didn't quite add into my stone inventory. But I definitely have a system going now. I cut a lot of things on the 360 to start, even relatively small stones, just because this lap is fairly, as I said, it leaves a pretty good finish. It's not super coarse, but it's also coarser than some of my 600 lap is a topper, which I don't always want to use on some small stones because it can actually be kind of coarse, and toppers have a little bit more wobble, and it's a balancing act of speed and tearing the stone off the dop. And actually, since I've been using the hybrid wax superglue method, I think I've only lost, I don't know, a handful, maybe 5 or so stones off the dop. Most of the time that can be chalked up to my impatience, where we'll see shortly here, but I have a kind of a cheat method to cut stones quickly, which isn't exactly, I don't know, it's not exactly frowned upon, but it can be tricky to do right, and it can tear your stone off the dop, as it did to me a couple times. But as we're just grinding away here, and I've got my plexiglass shield up because on the other side of the shield is my rough dopping station, and dopping station, and I don't want that coated in swarf, and I don't want it getting all over my table. I cleaned it off at the start of this video just so you could see through it. I hadn't done it in a while, and it was a little bit grody. Overall, there's not a lot of splash or swarf that gets out of the pan. You can see some of it's leaked out from cutting girdles, I think, in the past over the edge of the splash pan there. But overall, I think this kind of coarse grinding is the messiest step, the most prone to splashing. And we'll see that as I go too. You can see some flecks already kind of on the right-hand side, and most of it, because of the way the lap is spinning, will splash out kind of near the water bucket there on the right-hand side. And then you can tell I'm moving faster now because I'm like, come on, go, do the thing. And I'm realizing just how much I have to cut away still. And so very shortly we'll be moving on to the secret method. But I didn't want to cut anything out. This is the full faceting from start to finish of everything, every step, every annoyance. And I'm like, oh, look, I did that much. And I think I just stopped the video and restarted it. I'm moving to a new index now. So what I'm doing here is my little cheat method of you bring the stone over to the edge of the lap, and so the stone is essentially off of the lap and almost entirely except for a small corner, and then you hold the stone and the dop, or the handpiece in my case, so you're not putting too much pressure on it, just enough pressure to grind away, a third of a millimeter, a half millimeter, I don't really know what the measurement is there, but grind away a little bit, and then you pull it back into the lap, and that grinds away a lot faster for whatever reason. I don't know if it's coarser there or just something, but you can see I'm moving a lot quicker now. And you can see it kind of jerks at the very last second when I grind through the entire little bit that I've started to grind away. And this isn't something that you would want to do in a more, shock sensitive stone. Smaller stones either, although with smaller stones they would move fast enough where I guess I maybe wouldn't be as impatient to need to do that. But I've used this on so many stones now, and it saved me so much time because I was doing that other thing for 10 minutes, and I hadn't finished a single cut in for the first facet on this 9mm stone, and I've cut 15mm stones before. I would still be grinding away on that face for another 20 minutes, and then I would have to do that another 12 times or whatever 12 times for the symmetry here, and I wasn't looking forward to that. And so I think if you facet, you should probably know what I'm doing, where I'm cutting down one facet to a center point. And I don't know that it did it in this one, just because of the way that I was sort of hogging out the stone. But normally you want to kind of go, if you start off at 96 for your index, then if you have the symmetry for it, you would go to do 48 next. And so you create kind of a line across the stone so you can tell if you're, way overcut on one side or straight up and down. And then go to 24 and cut that in, and then cut in 72. And those 4 should cut into a point. And then you cut in the angles between it, and then those should meet up with the center point. Where if you go and do 96 and then 8 and then 16 and then 24 in that order, because you're kind of cutting asymmetrically, you can wind up at the end with a keel that you didn't mean to have, and you won't know exactly why that was until you cut the whole thing, and so then you have to go back and cut the whole thing again. And on this stone, I wasn't worried about, I didn't have any height limitations, obviously, because the stone is way too big for the size of the 9mm width that I have is only going to need 6mm height, something like that. And it's probably at least 15 to 20 millimeters long. So it's way too much stone, and I have lots of room for errors and cutting down and all that stuff. And, just like that, they all cut basically to a center point. On the 360, it's not super crucial that they meet up perfectly, because this is my coarse grinding lap, and I'll refine those points at the end, but I wanted to get them close enough so that I can cut in the girdle relatively levelly. And I have this 3D printed splash pan attachment that I got from Mike Zinski that I use all the time now. And it's super easy and flexible and a lot better than the metal insert that comes with the Raytech Shaws. At least the ones that used to come with it. I don't know what they're doing anymore. And so I'm at 90 degrees now for my angle, cutting in the girdle and lowering it gradually, because this puts a lot of, oblique pressure on the stone. It's one of the more hazardous times in faceting, cutting a girdle, just because of the way the forces act upon the stone in this orientation. This and the table are the worst. And I'm still doing the same cheat hogging out method here just to move things along, because sometimes it feels like the girdle can take a long time, and this is a long stone, so I have a lot to cut away. And I'm only going down just enough to where the meats will all match up, and I'm cutting sort of to where the that first row or the first pavilion angle facets will meet up with the girdle. And I have to do the girdle second, even though I think I have it first in my design instructions. I mean, you don't have to, but I'm doing it second in order to use those first pavilion angles as a guide. But you need to do the girdle before you do subsequent pavilion facets, because those pavilion facets have to cut to the girdle. So since that's where they meet, you have to cut to that. And based on this recording, it looks like my sort of preforming at the rough stage is about a third of the total time of faceting. And it can be a lot more if the stone is bigger or not optimal for the stone shape that I'm doing, if I have to cut away a lot more. And I'm starting to think more about either getting like a 4-inch saw blade to attach to the lap and use that to cut away excess before grinding, or taking the stone and preforming it more on the saw, because then you both save time faceting, but you also get sort of offcuts. And if it's a big stone and you're grinding away a lot of material, you can get a bonus stone out of it by cutting it away before grinding it. But what I've heard mostly is for the that saw blade method, where it would be where the lap is right now, and you get another sort of wider washer that creates a more stable spin for the saw blade to clamp down onto. And most of those are for people talking about using 6-inch saw blades on their 8-inch machines, because the more popular machines are 8 inches out there, like the Ultratech and the Facetron and all that. But the Raytech is a 6-inch machine, and I do have 6-inch blades, but they would be out to the edge of the stone, and because you need lots of water, I really don't want to deal with that mess of cutting and having cutting spray everywhere. Even with a splash guard, I think it would be a little excessive with the amount of water and all that. And I am worried about, torque yanking the stone, affecting the dop. I think it would break the dop or break the wax bond before it did anything to the handpiece itself. But I don't know, you never know. I could totally screw something up. I believe in me. And so after that, I don't know why I'm showing you, but it's about 9 millimeters. No cuts. Plus or minus, it was 9.8 to start, now it's 9.1. It's a little oblong, I think, in one orientation, but close enough to get started. And so stop the water. I need to let the lap spin dry. And look at that, it's already dry. Movie magic. So it's a simple matter of swapping out the lap with my next one, which is a 600 topper on a aluminum master lap that I got recently. I used to use a plastic one, which I don't know, maybe it was the topper, but it seemed like things were always just a little bit askew going from 600 to 1200 or another lap. It seemed like the facets were kind of askew from where they should be. And so I got a new master lap, and things have been going better. So now I got to raise my platform up so that I can cut the angle again and start over at my first pavilion facets. I'm going to cut those in because this is kind of my main, I won't say it's not the fine tuning, because I'm going to go to a 3000 grit in a little bit after we cut in all the facets. But this 600 topper will be the one that I use to cut in all the facets and get to pretty close to where I want them to be, and then I'll fine tune that with the 3000. Now I don't have to cut in too much. There's not a whole lot of subsurface damage to get out, even with the 360 lap. Maybe if I was using 100 grit or, a topper coarser lap, it might create more subsurface damage. I've heard of that being the case, but with the lap that I use, it's, I don't know, a millimeter at most. I don't even measure it. It's just, cut until it looks like it's has uniform facets on it, or uniform scratches. You can see the cats playing in the background there. And so just to kind of move things along a little bit, I'm putting light pressure with my finger on the stone, both for my peace of mind of not having the stone pop off the dop, even though I don't think it would do that much to prevent that. But it also pushes the stone back onto the lap, so it creates, more force and cuts a little bit faster. Although you do have to either use consistent pressure or be very careful about not overcutting, because if your stone, say, has directional hardness, or even if you press harder on one facet than the other, then you'll overcut and you'll ruin your center point. And unfortunately, because of the way that I filmed this using my phone to do the full thing, I'm not going to be showing intercuts of the stone in progress, so you'll just have to use your mind's eye. But I wanted to show the very glamorous side of faceting. Lots of repetitive little motions. And here, actually, what I'm cutting, I'm obviously cutting to the center point, but I'm also using both kind of the feel and the sound of the stone on the lap to cut. There's no depth gauges to show me when exactly to stop on the stone. There's no other helpful things other than sound and feel to cut using a Raytech Shaw. And so, that may not be for everyone, but it works for me pretty well. And I've gotten used to it, gotten accustomed to kind of the quirks of the machine a little bit. You can tell as the stone gets cut down that the sound sort of fades away a little bit. What else can I tell you? Oh yeah, there's a slight water drip. You don't need a lot. And I guess I didn't point out, maybe you saw it as it was kind of going there, but we do have some splashes on the splash pan now, or on the splash guard, the acrylic splash guard that I put up. It's a little bit messier than it used to be. I don't think it gets much worse than this, though, over the course of the rest of it. Maybe a few more splashes when I grind away the other side for the crown. But like I said, it's not super messy, but it is messy enough where if you're cutting lots of stones or big stones and you're grinding away a lot, like hogging out material, then you can have a lot of overspray. And I've found the acrylic works really well, both to clean up and visually, so I'm not staring at some opaque piece of cardboard, which I was doing for quite a while. And Mike Zinsky, who I mentioned made this girdle adapter, he also gave me and he makes and gave me a couple of attachments to go on the side of the machine, and you can screw them onto the box that the machine is sitting on, and then set a piece of acrylic down into it so that it's a, more or less permanent fixture that you can take out the acrylic still relatively easily to clean and whatnot. But it holds it securely, and it's great for if you take your machine out to demonstrate at a club show or something, because you really don't want to make a mess while you're there. You don't want to splash people. So I facet with the lap going counterclockwise, which directs the spray away from me. Some people facet clockwise, so the spray is directed towards them. If you're demonstrating at a show, you don't want to spray people in the audience, so you'd have to kind of turn the direction around the other way. But then you would get messy, and people would see you getting messy, and that may be a turnoff to some people. It would be an issue, both health and I don't want lots of dust on my clothes walking away from this machine. I want to be able to go and pick up my cat who barfed in the corner without having to worry about them breathing dust. And outside of the machines, a foot radius outside of the machine, there's not really much dust, and not much worse than is on other parts of my house that need dusting. But I do have a lot of rocks lying around, so that may add to the dust quite a bit too. And I think here I'm not really even looking at the girdles anymore, just kind of cutting in the same time on the stone in each facet. Just because with 12 girdle facets, that's a lot to do. Nobody looks at their girdle. Oh, and that was another thing that I was doing for this this run through of faceting. It was kind of a speed run where I am awful at recording the times that I started doing something, stopping certain angles. I start and stop, because of duties of the home, feeding the cats, doing groceries, laundry, or if Rachel is home and I'm doing some stuff, I can pop on for 10 minutes at a time maybe and just do a little bit of work. But I'm not very good at estimating how long everything is taking. And so I wanted to record everything so that I knew I could say, oh yeah, this stone took X amount of hours. Because sometimes it seems to take, 4 hours. Sometimes it takes 2 days. But was it 2 days of full working, or was it 2 days of, 1 to 2 hour stints here and there? And now you can see I'm not putting my finger on the stone anymore because we're not cutting away a lot of material. I'm just cutting down to the girdle here. And I'm not even using, I used to use an Optivisor 5 times headpiece lens, but I got out of the habit of that because it was annoying to have my focus change, and I had to have to look in weird directions, and it would always have sort of this blurry thing right in the peripheral of my vision, and it started giving me headaches, honestly. So I just use my 10 times loop for any magnification inspection that I need to do. I think I'm still working on those facets, but I took a break for feeding the cats maybe. Yeah, because I didn't adjust the platform height at all. So still cutting those in, mostly by eye. At 600, I can get pretty good by eye to the meets that I need to do. One thing you'll hear a lot of facers talk about is I mean the top or the toppers, the laps that you must have or the laps that you must avoid. And high up on a lot of people's list for things that you should just do without are topper laps. And I'm trying to be more open-minded, and I like to think that I'm a bit more open-minded, in part because Mike taught me using topper laps, but go with what works. I've used 600 and 1200 grit topper laps throughout my first 100 stones. I've kind of fallen away from the 100 or the 1200 grit lap a little bit more recently, but that's because I got my 3000 grit diamond paste with copper setup going now that I've started to use for more stones. But once you break in a lap like these toppers, they're, I think, perfectly functional. I've cut what I think are some really nice stones. Oh, and I'm flicking away a little bit of gunk that builds up on the bottom of the Teflon feet of the handpiece. You can see on the platform, I just pointed at it at the screen like you could see it, but there's kind of a white band in the middle and then two darker areas on the very center and the outside rim of the platform. And that's where whatever that coating is has worn away onto the feet of the lap. And I can't be certain, but I think sometimes that affects the tilt or the height of the handpiece and kind of throws things off just a little bit. So I do have to scrape that off periodically, which is kind of annoying. And I'm double checking what my next angle is. I guess I'm moving on to the... Oh, actually, I'm going back. And we are done with the 600 topper already, because the very last set of pavilion facets is so small that I'm just going to cut those in at 3000 grit. And I don't know why I left all this in, but we're drying the lap. Spin dry everything so that it's not going to rust on you. It takes a minute, 2 minutes, depending on how dry you want it to be. Yeah, double check the angle again, Pat. Good job. This is the glamorous life. And there we go. So turn off the machine, unscrew the little nut there. That aluminum master lap has a little bit of a tight fit, but it works fine. And this is my copper plated lap. It's not a solid copper lap. It's just a little copper plate on top of another aluminum master lap. But it seems like it's pretty good. I don't get a lot of tick, tick, tick for suggesting unevenness. And I have a stick of Pandemonium 3000 grit multi-crystalline diamond. I forgot exactly where I got it from, either Kingsley North or a Cutting Edge Supply. I bought the aluminum lap from one of them and the PCD from the other one. I don't remember which one was which. But I like to keep my water tank more than half full because I'm an optimist. But also because if the tank is more full, on this setup anyway, there's a more consistent drip rate. And I think I just stopped the video just so my phone wouldn't overheat or have too big of files, because I have to stop my video every 20 minutes or so, or else the file is too big to transfer off the phone. That's just a little behind the scenes peek there. And so since I have a lot of PCD on the copper lap, it moves pretty quick, so I got to start checking things relatively early on. So I'll do one sort of brief sweep across the lap and then check and then do a little bit more and see how, any adjustments I made are setting up, if they're fixing the problem. And this is probably where people would say I don't need to, if I didn't use the 600 topper laps, maybe this wouldn't be a problem, but I'm cutting in a little bit more with the 3000 grit than I possibly need to. Both for my peace of mind to move on to final polish, but maybe there's a bit more damage than I assume there was with the 600 grit that I'm cutting out now. But I also want to make sure that I get out all the big scratches and all that stuff. So I just have my loop more or less permanently affixed in my left hand with a little wad of paper towel in my palm, so that I could just I can wipe and look with the same hand at the same time without having to pick up and put down lots of things. So I guess looks like that was good for that facet. I'm trying to be more generous with the amount of diamond that I'm putting on the lap. I want to, I'm still not 100% sure I'm using this right, but I'm trying to avoid super loud squeaky metal noises when I'm using this lap, which is unavoidable in some cases because of the angles that I'm cutting on. Sometimes it just sounds like crickets. But when I go to a slightly more shallower angle, that noise disappears and it's just a grinding noise. But as I'm using this lap, I can definitely feel if I have too much water, I don't really get that sort of friction pulling the stone or pulling the handpiece that I'm resisting with my hand on the handpiece. And also I don't get that grinding sound. It's less grindy and more squeaky. Just sort of dragging a flat surface across metal is, the most apt way to put it, because that's what it is. So on my timeline here, we're now about 48 minutes in, and we are just cutting the 3000 grit stage of the pavilion. So things will be moving a little bit quicker here because this is just a fine-tuning stage, and then after the 3000 grit, polishing is, a few seconds per facet, and it's more a matter of the time that it takes to wipe off the facet, inspect it, make adjustments that take up all the time now. Whereas before I was having to cut in and make sure everything was meeting up well and centered and making fixes, which if I made a mistake and had to go back and recut the pavilion angles on a coarser grit for some reason, then that's another reason that this could take, 6 hours. And I've had that happen where I've been almost done with a stone. It was actually a gift aquamarine that someone else bought. It was a relatively expensive piece of aquamarine, and I was polishing the table, and it was only when I had polished the table that I noticed a crack in the table. And I had to go back and grind it out, and I thought, I just need to grind out a little bit. But one thing you learn quickly is cracks and inclusions are always deeper than they appear. And I started grinding and grinding and grinding, and I lost most of the table, or most of the crown of the stone, grinding out that crack, and had to go and recut the whole stone basically. And then I dropped the stone when I took it off the top, and it cracked again. So that stone, lives in infamy in my memory. But this one went okay. Didn't pop off the top. Getting the angle of the light right is one of the trickiest things, as you can see by my weird posture and contorted body here. The lamp is just to the left of my head, not over my shoulder, but over the machine. And so I have to orient things so that I can get a good reflection, but not too bright of a reflection, in order to inspect the job that I'm doing, which gets very tricky if the stone is really light colored. Sometimes it can be hard to identify scratches or subsurface damage in time, which is also part of why I kind of overcut some things, and we'll go back and fix them later. But looks like that pavilion P1 facet came in well, and we're moving on to the girdle. And I don't think I'm even going to look more than once or twice here at the girdle, because I'm not going to worry about cutting. I'm not going to polish the girdle. I'm going to stop at 3000 grit, because nobody's going to look at the girdle, like I said, and it's, a half millimeter or so at most. If it's set in stone, then, or if it's set in jewelry, then you're not going to see it for sure. And most people aren't going to look at the side of the stone and be like, oh, there's a very slight scratch here, or this doesn't look quite as shiny at the girdle, and it doesn't detract at all from the interior light play of the stone, so long as it's, kind of polished. Pre-polish is what the 3000 grit would be for me here at this stage. For a lot of people, pre-polish would be 3000 to 8000, I think is probably the most common, but some people might do 14,000 as their pre-polish grit stage, which just seems like overkill to me, at least, because with my even going from 3000 to 50,000 grit for my final polish, sometimes I have trouble finding, the very small things that I need to fix in the polish. So if I went from 14,000 to 50,000, I think it would be really tough to remember and figure out which facets I've already polished just by a cursory observation. And it would take me a lot longer to find things that I need to fix. But you can see the lap on the copper lap here, the center is relatively dry. Oh, and that was another thing. So I'm not using any oil in my setup. That was one thing that I kind of wanted to avoid from the get-go. I didn't want to deal with oil and the mess and having to clean off oil from my fingers and the stone after every time I touch it down onto the lap. Some people, they're fine with it. I know a lot of people do that. And there are some stones that would work better in oil than with water. But, kind of going back to the impatient cutter thing that I am, I don't want to deal with the fuss. I'm a simple man. Water is a-okay for me. Now, with water, because it doesn't grip the lap quite as much, I probably do lose more diamond, both in this stage and the final polishing stage. I probably lose more diamond than I would if I was using oil. But as we'll see when I get to the polishing stage, there's a technique that I use to kind of overcome that and avoid, just wasting all of my diamond all at once. And basically, the trick is to go slow. So throwing a little more diamond on there. And this is the name of the game is cutting, regular inspections, making sure the stone is clean so you're not looking at, a greasy fingerprint on it and trying to cut that away. or having to cut down. I don't think it was not in this stone because there's no inclusions. It's eye clean and loop clean actually. But some stones have, if they have inclusions on the inside, it can be very frustrating and difficult in some ways, where if you're trying to polish a facet and it's just not polishing, and you start overcutting the meats and you're just losing your temper, and then you sort of rotate the stone just enough to where you realize, oh wait, those aren't reflecting light on the surface of the stone, those are inside the stone. And you realize that you're trying to polish out an inclusion that's like a millimeter or two deep in the stone. So you always got to be mindful of that. And you'll see, totally unrelated now, back to the faceting itself. I slowed down the lap when I moved back to cutting these facets in, or pre-polishing these facets. I was just checking how much grit was on there, making sure if there's some powder or like milky, if it looks milky on my finger when I take it away from the lap after spreading the water out, then I figure it's okay. It's got enough grit on there that I can see it, so the stone could see it too. And you can see what I'm doing here, which I also do with my polishing lap, is I speed up the lap a little bit when I am actually cutting with it. And then when I take it away, I slow the lap down so that it flings less water and therefore less diamond off of the lap. I'm still going to fling some diamond off, but this way at least it's doing more work rather than in the 10 or 20 seconds that I'm looking at a stone, it's not wasting all that diamond washing it away while I'm looking at the stone. The diamond is doing more work for me. And also, I have to say my Raytech Shaw is also a little older. It's well used, more or less. And it does have a little bit of a electrical issue where I think I need to get the motor looked at because it does bog down a little bit more at slow speeds than I think it should. And so I do have to, that was the other reason that I started to do this sort of speed up, slow down method, is if I had it going low and slow, then when I put my facet back on the lap, it would slow down the lap enough that it would be useless. But now that I've got it all sort of fine-tuned and it's cutting in well, I just have to cut down to the meats that I need to meet and just check it regularly. So it's a pretty straightforward approach. I'm not sure if Morgan just came down. I thought I said something, but maybe not. But, yep. Just a quick inspection there, it looked like. I'm not going to pretend that this is the best performing stone in the world. I lowered the pavilion and the crown heights to make a brighter stone with less windowing, which I needed to do because there was a little bit too much of windowing anyway for my tastes. But by lowering the crown too much, you can make a really bright stone, but there won't be much for, fire or dispersion, just because it becomes kind of a reflector rather than, bending the light and all that. So there is a trade-off there with doing that manual optimizer that I did a while ago. But that's kind of why, that's also why I looked at it sort of in profile view, just to judge how proportionally correct the crown to pavilion heights were. For a lot of stones, I think somewhere between 60 to 70% of the width to pavilion height. Is that right? I don't know. Basically, less than, your stone is going to be less than 80% tall than it is wide. So if your stone is 10 millimeters, it's not going to be any taller than 8 millimeters. If your stone is 10 millimeters wide, it's not going to be any taller than 8 millimeters for most designs. If you're doing some specific optical phenomena, it may be more. And normally when I facet, for a while, I didn't really listen to a lot of stuff. And if I'm doing a really loud grinding stage, then I don't listen to anything because I can't hear anything anyway. And I didn't use it this time, but I do have hearing protection, earmuffs that I put on if I'm going to be doing something really loud. And I've actually used it a couple times for the high-pitched squeaky noises that my table faceting or polishing makes. For some reason, with the handpiece, doing the table polishing that can lead to really loud squeaky noises. And at some other weird angles too, or like shallow angles sometimes make squeaky noises, and it's really irritating, so I put on hearing protection for that. But I have started to use my phone more for watching videos or something in the background while I'm doing stuff. And I suppose this could be the part of the demonstration where we go into the, oh, what are you listening to nowadays? But I don't know, anything. Listen to what you want to listen to. A lot of people listen to music because it's sort of meditative. You'll see my drip rate is also really low with the copper, and it might be a little bit too low actually for this, but for polishing, something like a 10 to 15 second drip rate is decent. Maybe I'll go a little bit faster if I have to polish a really large table and I need to if I need to rotate the lap a little bit faster. But overall, you don't want a lot of water on the pre-polish and polishing stages because, like I said, it would just wash the diamond away. And it looks like in the timeline here, we're almost done with the diamond. Well, the copper lap anyway. All of the cutting on this lap and the other laps was all diamond. I do have cerium oxide and aluminum oxide, but I've only used cerium oxide, I think, twice now. The first time I used it on either obsidian or an X cube, the glass, really colorful X cubes. And it worked really well in that case, but I don't know if that was just beginner's luck because the second time I tried it, I think the first time was X cube, the second time was obsidian. I tried it with obsidian and I just kept getting more and more scratches, cat hair scratches that just wouldn't go away I couldn't get the balance right of slurry to water to compound to speed and watt and all that stuff. And it can be a balancing act. And so I cut everything now so far with my tin lap using 50,000 grit diamond powder. So we've spun dry our copper lap. Time to switch it out. And I have everything in a tower of laps. You can actually see it in the reflection there, at the top of it anyway. And I, stack it where the polishing lap is at the very top, pre-polish is the next one down, and coarser grits go further and further down, obviously, so you don't get any contamination of a loose diamond falling down onto a lower tier. And what I was doing there was kind of wiping off the stone on my hand to clean it off a little bit, since that PCD diamond has some compound with it that's a little bit sticky. It can gunk up and build up on the stone or weird places, and I want to avoid transferring that to my diamond lap, my diamond polishing lap. This tin lap came with my Raytech Shaw faceter, and it's, I think, one of the old stock, really pure tin laps. You can say you have a tin lap, but some tin laps are more tinny than others. I'm guessing this one is more than 98% pure, maybe 99%. But some tin laps might only be, 95% pure. So you got to know the composition, because even that, 3 or 4% can affect the hardness of the lap and the way that it polishes. But I found that the tin works to polish just about anything. It's soft, and so I think that's better for, softer stones for sure. And it may, maybe where it would fall short is to some people for YAG or sapphire, where those do really well with harder laps like, ceramic or zinc oxide, or, the BATT laps, the bat laps. But I have noticed in a couple, or I don't know, I've never really quantified it, but some of my girdle, or not my girdle, some of the facets may have a little bit of a rounded appearance, like at the facet junctions. I don't know if that's just the way that I look at it, or if that's actually what the case is. I've never really had other people comment on the quality of the, the lines that the facets where they meet up are. If someone wants to take a look at that and tell me, oh yeah, you got rounded girdles or something, rounded facets, then that would be interesting to know, because I know for a lot of people that's a turnoff, I guess, or it's not good for competition cutting. Maybe I should do a competition cutting just to see. But I usually, going back to the impatience thing, I get about, I don't know, a third of the way into a stone, and then I'm like, okay, yeah, this is good enough. Or if I have a troublesome thing, then I just want to get past it, because in most cases, I would say, a lot of the meats and all that don't matter. I think this might be the third video where I've said that now. But meats don't matter. If you want to have a specific design and with some optical phenomena that you're trying to do, like if you're doing a Kozibe effect, Kozibe, where you want the culet reflected in certain pavilions, then if you want the culet reflected in certain facets on the crown, then you may need everything perfect. But I've cut really crappy crowns and the stones still looked really nice. And it's all a matter of polishing rather than the meats. Obviously, none of the ones that I sell have the really crappy meats on them. Some of them may be more questionable than others, but there are some really wonky ones that are just kind of in my collection now, because I'm like, yeah, I can't bring myself to try to hawk this off on someone. Even though every stone is, as we see, 3 hours here, 3 hours there, 6 hours here or there. It's a little bit squeaky here. This one is maybe slightly at a low angle, and some of the smaller facets tend to be a little squeakier. But I know it's moving pretty quick. And as you can see, I'm speeding up the lap here, and then I'll slow it down when I'm done so that the water stays on there and I don't fling off the diamond, and I don't dry out the lap. Because I found that if I have my very slow drip rate, but I have the lap spinning relatively quickly enough to cut a facet or polish the facet, then it will, if I'm not actually doing anything polishing wise while I'm inspecting the stone, then the lap will start to dry out. And that throws off the water balance equation of my polishing system. And now this stone design that I made was purposefully not super complex because, like I said, I wanted to go a little bit quick with it. So I don't have to worry too much about like meeting up with 3 or 4 different facet junctions and all that. I think there might be 3 on the crown in a couple places, but overall it's not too complicated. Which that kind of simplicity is better for cutting faster as well. Like the standard round brilliant is overall a relatively fast, straightforward design, which is part of why it's so popular, even though there may be some other slightly better performing cuts out there in a similar, symmetry and roundness. One thing you'll notice going back and forth in different parts of the video if you're skipping around is the way that I hold the handpiece when I'm faceting. Like right now when I'm doing the polishing stage here, I'm only setting it down for a few seconds at a time. Of course here it's like 10 seconds, but since I'm picking it up and putting it down so often, I don't want to, let go of the stone and readjust my grip on the handpiece every time, because that adds up. And so I'm just holding it like this in the way that I would hold it while I inspect the stone so that things move quicker. And I'm able to apply even pressure like that, whereas for firmer grinding, I would sort of have my hand flatter in a more ergonomic position. Because that sort of pincer maneuver that I'm doing with the handpiece here can be a bit fatiguing over time. And there's Sokka in the background looking at something by the door. But yeah, that's, I don't know, maybe one of the drawbacks if you're looking for a faceting machine. If you have hand issues, carpal tunnel or RSI or something, you may not want to get a handpiece machine because you're going to have to do a lot of picking up of this. It's not super heavy, but over time the weight adds up, lifting it, setting it down. You got to be careful about setting it down, as opposed to just the arm of a mast machine that you raise and lower by a single peg or handle, whatever they call it. But it looks like we're done with that tier. I think that was the first tier. That took 14 minutes or so. And we're doing a quick swipe of the second tier, inspecting it. And looks like that might have been good, so we're moving on to the next one. Hello. Yeah.
Sorry.
The Rachel cameo. Hi, Rachel. Do you want to say hi?
There's Dada too.
There's Dada too.
Cat is recording something.
That's it.
Yeah, what's Dada doing?
I already know it.
Making
The
noise.
closet muffles extra noises, so it's a good place to record dialogue. Yeah, did
Are
we
you
find
having fun?
Dada?
Are you having fun? What's Dada doing?
I'm making noise.
Yeah, that's what I do, is make noise.
twins.
That's me. What's your name?
Who's that? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's Mommy's clothes.
Yeah, that's Mommy's clothes. Okay. Now I'm out of breath from wrangling a toddler. So, yeah, we're polishing away here. As long as I'm expounding upon things, I think 50,000 polish is pretty good for a final polish. Commercial polish, what I've heard is a lot of that is only up to 14,000, which is pre-polish, like I said, for some people. But even that can be, look good enough. And that's what it is in a lot of cases for, commercial cutters is it's just got to look good enough. But some people will go up to 100,000 grit for their final polish. I haven't seen, at least I don't think I've seen that in person to know whether it makes much of a difference between 50,000 and 100,000. And really, I could use 50,000, I could use 14,000, and the 14,000 could look better if my 50,000 grit was used on facets that weren't, prepared as well. And so with faceting, it's all about, just like with other lapidary polishing, it's creating finer and finer scratches until you don't see them. And the light, doesn't scatter. Because with, a faceted stone, you want the light to have an unobstructed entry point into the stone and then get bounced around because of all the angles in the pavilion and then come out the top and not have any obstructions coming out either. So you need two perfectly, transparent entry and exit points for every ray of light. So if you have kind of a roughly polished stone on the, on the top of the stone, that would affect light coming in and coming out. Or if you have poorly polished or poorly faceted, bottom pavilion facets, then you're going to get more scattering as it hits those, deeper grooves than what should be there. And so the light won't go where you expect it to go, and the angles that you so carefully crafted to reflect light in certain orientations aren't going to matter because the light's going to go wherever it wants to. But because of this, the other reason I moved up to the 3,000 grit for a lot of my stones for the past, few anyway, I've only had it for a month or so. I'll probably use 3,000 grit more often now because my polishing does take less time, because the 3,000 grit is closer to a final polish than my previous stages, where before, it depends on the stone, but sometimes I've gone from my 360 grit, coarse grinding wheel there, and then gone 600 to 1,200 and then polish. So from 1,200 to 50,000 grit is a lot steeper of a curve to meet. But I do have a 600 grit new bond lap, which is a resin, diamond impregnated lap. And that leaves a lot finer polish, actually, or comparable or maybe slightly better than my 1,200 grit topper lap. And so with that, I was able to go from my 600 new bond to polish on some stones like, quartz or topaz, that kind of thing. And yeah, where was I going with that? Yeah, so that's the end of that story. And you just saw Morgan come down the stairs for lunch. She was working from home at the time. And I'm going to stop it here, I think, so she doesn't have to be quiet or anything while we're making lunch. And it was lunchtime, so I was hungry too. But it's only been an hour and 20 minutes and it's already lunchtime. So obviously, I got a little bit later start in the day here. And like I said, I took a break to go do some errands between dopping and the cutting stage. So I probably dopped at like 9 o'clock and then went out and came back and started up again at like 10 or 10:30. What was I doing before 9 o'clock? Who knows? But now that we're done with the polishing stage, we can go and I got a crying baby. Now that everything's done and polished on the pavilion, it's time to transfer to do the crown. And I have a Raytech Shaw transferring jig where you attach the dop down in the bottom part there, and there's a little peg that slides down and you can align it that way. I'm going to choose the same diameter of dop for the doing the crown as I did for the pavilion, just to keep things consistent in case it was cut from, maybe different dops were cut from different stock, which might vary by just enough to matter. And I guess you get a little better view of my warming up the wax. There was enough wax on this dop already that I didn't need to add anymore, so I'm reusing old wax basically. And I'm just getting the whole thing warm enough to start getting the wax moving just enough to create an impression on the pavilion side. And this actually kind of goes with my impatience of being a cutter, in that I don't want to wait for epoxy or whatever to cure for 24 hours or 48 hours in some cases before I cut a stone or transfer a stone. That was, 30 seconds over the flame, make an impression in the stone, and then I'll grab the super glue and get the super glue on there, and we'll be on our way after removing the previous dop. And there was a little bit extra material here where I potentially could have cut away, or like, I'm debating whether or not to use a saw to cut off excess in these cases where there is a good 4 to 5 millimeters of yag that I just wound up grinding away. But I'm worried about the saw blade causing too many vibrations and weird forces that will, snap it off the dop. And then I'll have to worry about realigning everything, which is kind of a pain. And I'm still not super great at it, so it's very fiddly. I'm just putting a little bit of glue on the pavilion there now. And my super glue is a little bit tacky enough where it creates long strands if I don't kind of loop it around. And I just have I think it's a bamboo skewer as my lid now that has a bunch of glue built up around it. And I just make sure that it's all lined up and press the dop down securely, but not, with incredible force, because I don't want to skew the stone or do anything weird by applying too much force. You let the glue do the work. And once again, just putting a little bit of drop of the Instaset accelerant on the CA glue around the outside there. What's in the pavilion, like near the culet, may not be cured at this stage, but just that little drop is enough to make it so that I can move on to the next stage and take off the old dop and get going. I don't know that I started doing it in this case, but in other stones, I've gone from putting the glue on, putting the accelerant down, and I've been faceting. I took it right over to the bench and started cutting away, being a little careful at first because the super glue may not be as hard as it could be, but the stones survived and they worked fine. If it didn't work, then I wouldn't do it. at this stage. And so I just heated up the old DOP and removed it because the wax, there was both wax and super glue. There's still super glue on the top of the stone, but the wax loosened enough where I can take it, and I just use an old X-Acto knife to get off some of the excess, and that's it. And I was going to try to show it to the camera, but there it is. And back to this view again. Still have the polishing lap on there to show you the intricate process of putting the DOP stick in the Raytech Shaw handpiece, tightening it down, and that nut that I just tightened down is actually one that was made by Mike to replace the one that came with my old Raytech Shaw handpiece. The one that Mike gave me has a little bit of a bigger thumbprint, or a footprint, whatever you want to call it, so I can grip it a little bit better, and it holds a little bit more securely than the other one. It still loosens a little bit. If I grind away a lot, the vibrations can cause that to loosen, because it's not like an Allen wrench set screw like they have on mass machines. This one is just, the DOP has a little screw on the back, or the DOP is threaded on the back, and that nut attaches on the top to hold it in place, sort of by compressive strength. And there's a little notch in the end of the handpiece where the little peg lines up to do, your oriented stone. And I'm not even going to mess around in this case with this one, where I think I pretty much jump almost right away into just grinding away, since I already gave away that secret in the cutting the pavilion. But I have a lot more to cut away in this case, so there's going to be a lot more grinding here, so you're going to want to skip ahead if you're not interested in the voiceover part of this. If you're not interested in what I'm saying, you've probably already skipped ahead and aren't hearing this anyway. Or maybe you can't hear it over the grinding if I didn't do the sound mixing properly. Maybe I should have some music in the background to lighten the mood. No, that's enough. So, I'll say neodymium YAG is the first material that I ever faceted over at Mike's workshop where he taught me. So that was fun. I have kind of a soft spot for it, I suppose, now. But it does look pretty. It has a really good dispersion, has hardness of 8.5 like other YAG. And it actually has a little bit of like a color shift wherein it can look different, the purple to pink depending on the light and depending on the cut. I took not this stone, but there was another stone that I cut that was a little bit bigger, and just going from my kitchen to my living room, it kind of shifted from pinkish to purplish, which was kind of neat to see. And so what I'm doing here is, besides just grinding away, obviously, at this stage, I have my, first crowned angle set at the index that whatever I need it to be at, 4, I think it is, maybe. And actually, I should probably go get that. Let's go get that. Okay, so I grabbed the paper. You can hear that, the ASMR of the paper rustling. I finally realized I should probably grab the diagram so I can talk about what I'm doing here as we go across the stone. So I'm at 34.15 degrees, more or less. Probably on index 4. And this stage is just meet the girdle. Or set the stone size, basically, or set the stone height. And in this case, I'm going to leave a little bit extra meat to cut down in subsequent lap grit sizes. because you got to leave enough to cut away the coarseness of this lap, basically. And this stage will take a while because you have to cut away all that excess on the top. It's one of the longer stage. I find that the preforming kind of roughing in shape takes a long time, just in terms of the amount of work that you need to put in. Whereas with the actually getting the facets lining up where you want them to go, that's kind of the other bulk of the time, because you need everything to meet up, where you need it to meet up. And you got to be careful not to overcut or undercut and get things lined up that way. So there's the labor here in just, whatever you would call this, I almost like physical labor, whereas the other one is more mental, aligning things up and finessing it into place. And because of the way that I'm cutting this here, I'm not too particular about having it exactly level on the girdle at this stage. Although my lap does cut a relatively good... It is... one of the things you'll hear is that you don't really need to worry about if your girdle is lined up on the very coarse laps, because they're not, even enough to really be able to tell. And that's true. I can get a pretty good feel for if the stone is really uneven or wonky on this lap, but I usually save it for like the 600 or a little bit finer grits before deciding if I need to adjust the cheater significantly, or my little the feet on the handpiece there. And in this case, I just cut in the 4 facets, so now I flipped it around 48 degrees. Now I'm doing at 52, mostly to get away the other bulk, the rest of the bulk, and then I'll be able to cut it in easier on the subsequent facets going around. That's a little bit more of a dirty acrylic splash guard there now, I see. But like I said, this is the messy part, really. So I suppose if you were demonstrating at a show and you didn't have a guard, then you may want to sort of preform a bunch of shapes and get things where you can go into the 600, 1200, 3000 grit stages, and that would be a lot less messy for you or for the audience. And I don't think it's obvious here, but I have my hand resting on the handpiece there, but I'm not really applying pressure. That's just to keep the handpiece from moving. You don't want to apply too much pressure, like I said, when doing the other side, because when you go off the lap, kind of the torque and trying to push it, you're pulling it back into the lap in my case. That can create weird forces and break the stone off the dop if you're not careful, or if you apply too much pressure. And as the stone gets finer and finer, you got to worry about your fingers. So I'm not doing that edge thing right now, because enough is cut away where the rest of the facets will cut in quickly. So I don't do it on every case, but that's kind of the roughing in, and then I can go back and cut it in like this, the proper way, if I need to, with the rest of the facets. Oh, I guess I am going onto the edge. Make a liar out of me, will you? In terms of the design of the stone, I wasn't being, you saw me doing it in real time there. I didn't plan anything. I didn't have any design that I was basing it off of, except that I wanted to do a 12-sided design to do a kind of round where I didn't want to do a full 16 girdle facets. So 12 is a good compromise because, 8 or 10 can sometimes feel like a little bit more of a shape rather than a round, like an octagon. And so with just a little bit of, I've obviously practiced. I've had GemCut Studio now for a while, and it's a great program. I think it's going to be updated soon with a lot of new features. So keep an eye out on it for it, I guess, if you're interested in gemstone design. If you're a faceter, it's really helpful. And if you're more than just if you just facet more than once ever in a while, you might want to get it because it has a lot of cool features like the cutting assistant, so you can preview how things are cut, which can be really tricky with some designs. Like I did a frosted cross, which is in a shield or a kite shape design. And that one, the proportions of the stone were really weird, where I had a lot of trouble, and I probably should have done a cutting assistant to help visualize things. And I did go back and look at the design in GemCut Studio after I started cutting, but by that point it was kind of too late, and I was like, oh well, I'll just forge ahead and try to compensate for my mistakes as we moved along. But it helps with designing stones. And one of the things that I noticed really quickly with looking for designs was a lot of the designs that are publicly available, there's, I'd say, two main resources that I can think of offhand. One is the Gemology Project, which is kind of like a wiki-based collection of facet diagrams and other gemstone information. And those ones have a lot of really nice diagrams. But there's another one called the Faceting Academy, or no, facetdesigns.org. Faceting Academy is a website and company that's actually really good and has lots of good tutorials, so go watch their videos. But I think facetdesigns.org, they have just like they have thousands, 30,000, something like that, facet diagrams. And you can search it, and the search function is okay. It's manageable, I guess, more or less, if you have an idea of what you're looking for. It's not good for just browsing, because there's too many. But what I found is if I'm looking for a design that works in quartz, or low RI, I guess, like sunstone, quartz, glass, like the X cubes, the diagrams that are on there, and some that are just, out in the public, those say that they're designed for, quartz 1.54 refractive index. But if you load them into GemCut Studio, or if you cut them, you'll find that they actually window terribly in some cases, or like the point of those stones that they designed wasn't apparently to look good. I don't know. There's a lot of highly windowed stone designs available. There's a lot of stone designs that are available that I wouldn't want to waste my time cutting and then find out that there's a window, which to some extent you don't have to get into GemCut Studio to check every single diagram. If the angles don't match the critical angle of the material that you're cutting, then, don't cut it, I guess. If you have a supposed quartz design that has a pavilion angle of 37, that's going to window because it's below the critical angle of 40.5 or 41, whatever it is. Is it 39? Somewhere between 39 and 41. I can't remember offhand because I'm on the spot. And you want to usually go a couple of degrees above the critical angle just to avoid it and to avoid windowing quickly. So like with the YAG here, the critical angle is 33.6 degrees or something. We'll just call it 33 degrees. But I wouldn't want to design a stone with, big pavilion facets that are 33 degrees because then as soon as you start looking at it a little bit off axis, which is most of the time you'll be looking at it, or when someone else is looking at it, if it's on your ring or something, they're going to just see the window and not the stone color or dispersion or any of that. The light's just going to go through from their point of view. And so you want it to have a little bit of a buffer zone to reflect light and to reflect it from many different angles, or a broader angle. And so if you jump back to the design portion of this, when I was doing what's called the tilt windowing preview, where it kind of had the stone going up and down and side to side, that was set to, I think, 15 degrees is one of the common, angles to look at. So that means that if you're looking at the stone from 15 degrees off axis, how much windowing and brightness will there be in that case? And if your windowing spikes, or if your windowing dips down to like 0 when you're looking straight at the stone at 0 degrees, but then it jumps up to 20-25% windowing as soon as you go 5-10 degrees off axis, then that may be a sign that you're going to have a lot of performance loss as soon as you start looking at it from different perspectives. I honestly kind of blanked. Are we on the 600 stage, or are we still on the course lap stage? Okay, so this is still the roughing in stage. But the way that I'm inspecting it makes me think that we might be almost done. Oh man, we still got like 10 minutes left of this preforming stage. But like I said, this is a long stage to cut away everything. So the first angles were at 34.15 degrees. The second crown facets are at 26.5 degrees. And then the third are 20 and then 15. And so for me, those, at least the first three from 34 to 26 to 20, those are far enough apart where I'll be cutting enough material that I might want to cut all of them on this course stage just to get rid of bulk material. A little bit more material, I guess I should say, so the subsequent stages will go faster. But I'm not going to cut in the C4 facets in this case, which are 15.4 degrees, both because they're really shallow and will cut quickly, but because they're very similar to the previous tier of C3, which is 20 degrees. So just a few degrees difference there. And that'd be really easy to overcut, and it will be really easy to cut in with a finer grit stage on the next step. I don't know why I'm using my finger here at this stage. Maybe just to move it along faster? Am I that impatient? Either that, or it seems like sometimes the dop or the handpiece or something, I won't say is out of alignment, but like going from 48 to 72, sometimes it seems like it doesn't cut to the same depth when I rotate on the indexes. And so maybe I'm compensating a little bit there by pushing it down so it cuts to the same depth. But I am also trying to move a little bit faster here, like I said, to do a speed faceting, to the point where I haven't looked at the camera in a while to see that it's getting more and more askew. If you scrub through the footage of this, you'll see my camera angle, like getting drunk and falling down and coming back up. And, right now we're pretty lopsided here. But I didn't want to think about the footage while I was cutting this. I wanted to just keep going and try to get the stone out relatively quickly. And so not everything is in perfect alignment on the final product, but I'm not going to show it up close, and I just show it from afar and it still sparkles, so you'll never know if I didn't tell you. Anyway, since I don't have anything else to say at the moment, if you need a stone faceted, if you're still watching at this point, thanks, I guess. But if you need a stone faceted, I'm open for commissions. I think I'm pretty cheap relative to some other faceters. If you provide the rough, then it's just like the labor and time involved that I would charge for. But I do have a lot of rough, synthetics and some natural stones that we could work something out to design, and I won't charge an arm and a leg for the rough either. Or if you just want a pretty stone that's already faceted, I have a lot of maybe higher end, but nicer stones on my Etsy at donahuelabs.etsy.com. You should go there and check them out if you haven't already. And I do have a Patreon as well now, as of a few months ago, with a few members. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, both those that are currently supporting and have done in the past. It does mean a lot to me that I have people that are like, oh yeah, it's cool that you do these things, and we want to see what you do, and we want to help you make videos like this. Where, this video doesn't take a lot of financial resources, but in having a little bit of financial support, it allows me to take the time to both cut a stone for 3 hours and then record voiceover for 3 more hours to explain the process in a teaching way. And I'd say that's probably one of the main goals of my YouTube channel, as long as we're getting introspective and have nothing else to talk about. I like being educational in my videos and not just focusing on pretty rocks for pretty rock's sake. Partly because I can't be excited, as you can probably tell by the way that I talk, that I'm a little bit understated in some of the ways that I talk. Stones are pretty cool. Gemstones are neat. I like cutting them. They sparkle. But I'm not going to make a video. I can't make an unboxing video. I've mentioned this to someone in the past, that unboxing videos I just can't do, because I'm like, oh yeah, there's a stone, cool. Oh yeah, oh, here's another stone, yeah. This one's petrified wood, neat. Some people can vamp like that, and I can't. What were we talking about? YouTube. So yeah, my channel, I think some of the support, the support from some people I know from the community, from people commenting on my videos and whatnot, but I'm hoping that the support for those will allow me to make more of those sort of documentary videos. And we're almost done here, actually, so maybe I'll just stop talking until I figure out what the next clip is going to be. But spin dry the lap dry again, and there it's dry. Movie magic. But I guess we're just going to be cutting down in the 600 grit stage now. So this is all old hat now. I have a lot of, so I'll go back to YouTube anyway. I have a lot of videos sort of in process or in my head or written down at various stages of progress. A lot of a little more in-depth investigations into certain kind of gemstones, especially those found in the Pacific Northwest here. Like I've done the opal from Eastern Washington and sunstones and the Columbia Basin agates. It's kind of an ongoing story, but the financial side of that can be tricky, and I'm getting stonewalled on getting responses back from various institutions and individuals about further analyses. But I want to be able to go and, schedule time to talk with someone down in Oregon or over in Idaho about gemstones that are in the area, like star garnets. That would be cool to do. Petrified wood from Saddle Mountain. Who's an expert on that? I gotta, take time to research who I could talk to about that and who would be willing to talk to me about that, ideally on camera. Because I'll go into a little bit of a behind the scenes here for the first documentary I did about opal. In the credits, there's an opal consultant that I credited, and that's because I talked to Jurgen, I think his name was. If not, I'll put his name up here. I talked to him in Germany over the phone. He didn't want to be on camera, which was fine. But I wanted to make sure that I got my facts straight about opal and the formation and the, current state of research, because he had just finished his doctorate in opal and had a pretty cool theory about how they formed, and it answered a lot of questions about, the timing and how the mechanics of that could work, and the, formation temperatures, conditions, locations, all the different kinds of locations of different opals that are out there, high and low temperature, in sediment, in wood, and other, other kind of things like that. And that took a long time to, organize and find him, talk to him. I tried contacting him, and it was like something came up at the last minute, so it got pushed back. And I was also trying to get information from the University of Idaho about their gemstone book. I forgot what it's called now, but it's like one of their most prized possessions was this book of with gemstones on the cover from local gemstones like opal and some other things. And they had a couple of photos online, but I was trying to work with them to get a photographer access, to it. And I wanted to take a photo, but they were like, well, it's in the president's library, or it's in the president's, office, and isn't really out on display. And so you can't just go in and take a photograph of it like if it was in a library somewhere. And so you had to schedule access, but they didn't want to schedule access for just anybody. And I guess they had for a while been wanting to do a more in-depth documentation of it, like with better photos and more photos, because they only had like 3 online. In part because, it's their precious gold book, or silver and gold book is what it's called. Yeah, because that's their school colors, is the silver and gold. And it's, it's real gold and real silver on that book cover. It was a while ago, so I've forgotten a lot of those details. But they had talked about having their photographer come in and do all this work, but it wasn't going to be done until the end of the summer. And at this point, it was, spring of the year. And I didn't want to wait 5 months for a couple of photographs that weren't super critical. I could just point people towards them as a future resource to look at. And I don't know, I guess I haven't looked in recently, but by the end of the year, they still hadn't done the photography, so I would have been waiting for nothing at that point. Sometimes institutions can move real slow. I forget where I started this conversation or this tangent, but I think it was on like getting my facts straight. on these documentaries and the amount of research and effort that I put into them. And it's probably going to bug me forever, but I had a draft of my script for that and made a couple of edits and kind of squished some phrases together that probably shouldn't have been squished together. And so I ended up calling opalescence, or equating opalescence to play of color in like the first 10 seconds of the video of my talking. And that's not what opalescence is. Opalescence is different from play of color. And someone commented on that, and I was like, oh, I didn't notice that. Crap. But they're right. It's not the same thing, but I can't edit the videos, unfortunately, at this point. I'm not going to take it down and redo it. I guess some people will just come out of there knowing that, or thinking that opalescence was the same thing as play of color, and like all opals have play of color or something, but that was my mistake. But you just have to go down into the comments to find all the little nitpicky ways that people will find to tear down things that you say. Which fortunately doesn't happen a lot on my videos. At least not to this point. Probably because I'm not popular enough to have dedicated haters like on some channels. And so, yeah. And to some extent, I'm trying to limit myself to topics that I know a little bit about. Like the geochemistry, I kind of focused on the geochemistry side of sunstones because I was more familiar with geochemistry and was able to have a somewhat intelligent conversation with Dr. Cahoon down there at OSU about them. Which a lot of it made it into the documentary just because she's such a great speaker and can talk off the cuff about sunstones for, as you saw, like an hour. But there's even more footage that wasn't included in that is actually available for Patreon members only. Most of the interviews that I've done, I have to cut them down for the documentaries, obviously, because you talk about a lot of stuff that isn't relevant or just doesn't cut well with what we're talking about in the documentary. But a lot of it is still really interesting, I find, talking about geology and rocks and gemstones and geochemistry and analyses and all that stuff. And so I've decided to make all those Patreon only videos. So if you go over to Patreon, then you can get access to those and listen to Dr. Cahoon or who else did I have? Lydia. I can't remember her last name offhand. And Kate and Jason Shull talk about agates and the Columbia River and Montana agates and all that stuff. I don't want to lose those interviews because they're interesting and those people took a lot of time out of their day to talk to me about them. So I don't want to just leave everything that they said on the cutting room floor. But I don't want to just publish it as a separate YouTube video because then it's kind of odd. It's repeating information, or there's also a thing with YouTube where like if you repeat too much content between videos, then you'll get copyright or not content restrictions where they could demonetize your channel for having too much repetition. So I don't want to have a lot of overlap between my videos. in terms of having, 45 minutes of Emily talking on the Sunstone video, and then, an hour and a half of her talking, but 45 minutes of that is the same for the full interview. I don't know what their threshold is, but once they come after you, it's hard to dig yourself out of that hole. Okay, so that's enough about YouTube and Patreon, I suppose. The stone is coming along well, I think. Just cutting in those facets. This should go a little bit quicker than the previous stage. Both because I've learned there's kind of a balancing act between how much you cut down with that 360 lap or whatever your coarse sort of grinding away lap is. You want to leave enough where you can cut out, any chips that might form or the subsurface damage from that lap. But I've made the mistake of leaving way too much girdle space that I've had to cut away with these finer laps, and it just takes forever sometimes. And like I said, I just keep coming back to being an impatient faceter. You got to find that sweet spot of you don't have to cut away a lot to get rid of the previous lap imperfections, but you want to leave enough to get rid of those imperfections. And so I think I've found that with practice with that previous lap, I'm better able to get that sort of estimate. And it depends a little bit too on, the hardness of the stone or the complexity of the facets. With this design, those first C1 facets, the crown 1 facets, they're relatively small, so they do cut in quickly by themselves, and they will polish relatively quickly because they're small. There's not a lot of really big surface area facets on the crown of this design, which means that it'll all polish relatively quickly and actually kind of in the same amount of time, which is nice. If you have a really big facet, then usually the table is one of the biggest facets on the top of the stone. But with some designs, it can be at an angle. The big facets take longer to polish and pre-polish and can be a little bit trickier to meet up properly. Whereas with smaller facets, you can kind of push them around in the pre-polish and the polish stage to get them where you want them to be without too much trouble. Like especially the C4 facets on this design, the little compass shapes or compass points. Those ones move really quickly because they're long and skinny, or stubby in one case, in the 4 cases. So those ones, I wasn't too careful about getting those into their perfect place either. Although I did cut them with the 600 lap, I'm pretty sure, just because I wanted to get an estimate of. I didn't want to take forever cutting them in with the pre-polish lap. I wasn't sure how fast they would cut in. And based on the waveform, it looks like I'm about done with this, or I'm just taking a long time to examine it. Maybe I'll be moving on to the next angle here. Yep, so this is the next tier of facets. I assume this is C2, the 26.5 angle one. And I found once I go through the stone, certainly by the second lap that I've gone through all the facets, you kind of get not quite muscle memory, but the numbers of the indexes that you're using are relatively fresh in your mind. And it's easy to go back and cycle through them without having to triple check which facet or which index you should be on in every case. And especially with this one, C2 and C3 are actually cut at the same indices, but just at different angles. And so, it's every 8 as well, 8, 16, 32, etc. And so once I did that a couple times, I was like, okay, you don't really even need to look at the diagram anymore as you cut. Unless you have trouble with mental math in some cases, which sometimes it's good to check. And actually looking at this now, it's actually not every 8, because it goes by, because I mirrored it by 8. So it's 8 to 16 is 8, and then 16 to 32 is 16, and then 8. So it's 8, 16, 8, 16 as differences between the indexes there. So yeah, if you did go by every 8 in that case, then you would be cutting the wrong index, and you got to remember which one to skip over. But we're officially over the 2-hour mark now. That's exciting. Break time. What are you doing?
That pattern.
Yeah.
That is lost. That rabbit's lost.
Mm-hmm.
Where's my lost?
Where are your clothes? We're not in your closet, are we?
Can you do it?
Do you want to press the red button to stop?
Yes.
Okay. Press that button there. On a totally unrelated topic, today is a few days after the video came out by Angry Turtle or Turtle's Horde. I can never remember which one they are exactly. I think it's Turtle's Horde. Where they are now selling a thing that they call Cut Kit, which is a lot of accessories and adapters for one of those really cheap faceting machines, one of the Vivor models, which is like $250, $270, something like that. And they said that they watched my video about, doing a lot of the upgrades and things that we did over at Mike's shop for fixing up the really cheap one that was like $220 all told. And I thought that was pretty cool to see that sort of have more of an effect than just people saying like, well, should I get this model or not? To have someone come in and get a lot of those fixes established in a way that they can, produce them for people en masse. Because a lot of the fixes that we did over at Mike's shop was kind of a one-off thing. I think he has made at least one more table adapter for another person to raise the mast height. And a comment on the video, one of them was that, if you have a mast height adjuster, then that raises the level of the lap like we did. Any slight misparallelism will be magnified, which makes sense. Or if there's a very slight difference in the machining of the part that it goes on and like it sits very slightly askew, then you're going to have difficulty that way. But I think overall, a lot of the fixes we did, and definitely a lot of the fixes that are available in the Cut Kit, which this is not sponsored in any way by them, but that is a lot of the fixes that needed to be done and to make that machine more usable, or usable at all, really. In a lot of ways, it was not usable right out of the box, the one that I got. But it is kind of one of those things where I think I've been upfront about the price of my machine. It was like a little over $1,000 all told, plus a little bit of shipping. I got a pretty good deal on shipping because the person set the shipping price before realizing that they had to send it all the way from Maine to Washington, Washington State, not Washington, D.C. So I probably could have chipped in a little more for shipping, but they were willing to take the hit on that and help out a fellow faceter, future faceter, I guess, is kind of what this is about. And that's one of the cool things about the hobby is the lapidary community is really supportive of one another. There are some trade secrets, but for a lot of things, like people want to know how to cut this stone, there's going to be someone talking about it and all the troubles that they've had or the ways that they've gotten around cleavage and fracture issues. Because in a lot of ways, it's a very high entry point to get into the hobby. Mine was $1,000, and then I had some odds and ends that I picked up from Mike for basically at cost prices, or that he just gave me to help me get started. And that helped lower the cost for me up front. And so when I resold that machine that we fixed up, I just sold it at face value plus the extra shipping that it took to get from here to where I sent it to, which is kind of my goal. My plan from the get-go was to just resell it just to make my money back, basically. And it also helped out someone else get started in the hobby. But one of the things that I probably didn't press upon too much, or enough, I guess I didn't press upon it enough when I was doing the review / fixing up of that model, was that the machine, the quill, we fixed a lot of the problems with angles and getting the table and doing the, being able to fasten a girdle less than 20 millimeters for a stone. But the quill itself was not super great construction. I mean, it was in one piece, but there was a lot more play than there should be in a faceting quill. And so even if you're set at 45 degrees for an angle, you can push down on the quill or push up, and if you don't have the same pressure, I didn't really check how much play there was because I just cut a stone quick. I didn't do any systematic testing, but I'm pretty sure there was a lot more play than there should be, and I mean definitely more than there should be, because you don't really want any play at all if possible. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was like a third to a half a millimeter of wiggle room of the dop of the quill, and what was with the quill inside of the sort of set piece that hooked onto the machine. But the person that bought it from me hasn't complained to me about it, I guess. But it's kind of one of those things where you get what you pay for, where if you spend $250 on a faceting machine, you can't expect the same level of precision as you would expect with a $1,000 or $5,000 machine like you have to spend on some of the higher end models. And I think at the time I said something about how the Ultra Tech, or those machines have been around for 40, 70 years in some cases, depending on how you count models. But you go from the Graves to the Ultra Tech, different manufacturers, I guess. I don't really remember all the different ways that those things have changed hands over the years. But you have the Ultratech V2 and then the V5, and the V2 was made in the 70s, and it's still perfectly serviceable. And you can get a V5 for twice the price of a V2. But if you can get a V2, then that's definitely going to be better than the newer $250 machine, even though the V2 is, what is it now? 50 years old at the time. The 2000s were just a few years ago, right? So anyway, you can see I'm chugging right along. It looks like I'm about to cut in my final few facets on the table. I don't remember if I cut in the table on the, or cutting the final few facets on the crown. Probably dialing in the 15.4 thing. And I think at this point I'm trying to decide how I cut in either the table or those facets that kind of float in where they don't really have any meats. Because when you first cut them in, it's just a free floating diamond, more or less, and then you cut in the table and it looks like you cut the table to a meat, but before that there's not a meat to cut to. Yeah, it looks like I'm still at a pretty steep angle here. I think I got sidetracked from my V2, V5 precision thing, but the bottom line is, you know, a well-used 50-year-old machine that was manufactured to higher tolerances back in the day will be much better than a modern, mass-produced Chinese Lee impersonator machine that you get for $250 from eBay. But I would assume most people would know that. And it's just a matter of knowing what you're getting into when you're getting those machines. And for a lot of people, that price point is too much to overcome. And so if they don't have that option for a cheap model, then they just can't do anything and the hobby starts to die off. If everything is $5,000 to get in, how do you train beginners, or how do you have an amateur base to support your hobby? Because there's only so many professional cutters out there that can support themselves doing this. I mean, I'm not supporting I don't make enough money cutting gemstones right now to count as a professional lapidary. And I've been doing this for a couple of years now, not selling the whole time, but working on it. And the only other option, if you don't want to spend the $5,000, $3,000 in some case for like maybe a Facetron you can get for a decent price. But if you don't have a local club, then, or the other option is to look for a local club. And maybe they would have a faceting machine that you can use or be taught on. Like I didn't have a faceting machine when I learned, and I learned from Mike, who had Ultratechs and Raytech Shaws, and I went with the handpiece because it looked kind of interesting, and I liked the idea of being able to pick it up and look at it like I'm doing right now, and it have a little more tactile feedback to it. And so it looks like we're done with the 600 grit, so we'll cut to the next stage here soon. But yeah, and then even in that case, some clubs will have waiting lists for learning how to facet, which is fine. If it's popular enough, then that's good as well. But I've heard like some clubs down in San Francisco have waiting lists of up to 2 years to learn how to facet. And then it's like, I don't know what the price is for the San Francisco clubs, but some places might charge several $100s for a few days of lesson. And then if it's in a big class, how do you get that one-on-one time to really learn and get feedback on the stone in real time, rather than, you know, waiting for little answers to questions or someone to come around and help you, or notice that you're doing something wrong and help you before you get too far to really fix things easily and get frustrated with a stone. Whereas a local person, like someone like Mike, who teaches people for free here, if you're in the area, he's there, you know, the whole time while you're cutting a stone. If you have a question, ask him. If you just send him, we were just chatting most of the time, or he was doing most of the chatting, but because although I've been talking for 2 hours and 20 minutes, I'm not really a chatty person, just by the way that I am. I'm pretty good at listening though. And I enjoyed hearing Mike's stories of anything and everything in the lapidary world back from as long as he's been in it. But someone that does one-on-one classes or very small groups is a little more ideal for learning how to facet, because there's a lot of fine detail and learning that goes into it. But I do hear good things about the Columbia Willamette Facet Guild, who has classes that are based out of the Rice Museum near Portland, Oregon. They do classes, and it's a several days for a really good price, from what I hear. They do have, I think, like maybe 10 machines set up, maybe 8 to 10. I can't remember. I did a tour of it, and they had a lot of good machines, both I think Facetrons and Ultratechs. They're all mass machines, which is fine. It's a good machine. There's a good machines to learn on. And I don't know what their teacher to student ratio is, but even with 10 people, if you have a couple people there, which I assume they would, then that's a decent number. But if I don't know if classes get up to like 25 in some areas, then that seems a little crazy for trying to get one-on-one teaching. It's kind of like college courses where you have one graduate assistant teaching a class and there's 30 students and they all have questions, so it's not everybody gets the same out of it. If you don't ask questions, then you're going to be lost because the person might be pulled away to someone that's willing to ask questions. But there's also people like Alan Lindbergh, who I interviewed and had a really long interview on my channel here a little while ago, who's south of Portland. And you can talk to him about getting a one-on-one faceting class. I don't know what his rates are or the timing, but you can bring your machine or he can provide one for you and do one-on-one teaching with a master faceter or master rated faceter based on his qualifications with the United States Faceting Guild competition cutting. And I've seen a lot of his cuts and they're really nice, and he's definitely knowledgeable about the subject. And I'm sure there's lots more people out there that have a machine that could teach people. Maybe they do, and maybe the word just doesn't get out as much. Like I think Alan relies on word of mouth for getting students. He doesn't advertise because it's a lot of effort and money in some cases to advertise. But if you can find a resource like that, or have a resource like a club to point you towards another resource of a teacher, then you'll have a much better starting point for your faceting journey, or whatever you want to call it. And if I hadn't had that lesson from Mike, which I only cut one stone with him and then kind of went off on my own and did things, although I checked in with him with various questions along the way, but I cut all the rest of my stones at home on this machine, from stone number 2 to whatever I said this was, 113, 114. And I wouldn't have bought this machine sight unseen if I hadn't had that lesson and been like, yeah, this is something that I want to do. This is something that I'm interested in. I cut a stone and I enjoyed the process and I liked the end result. So let's keep going with it, because I'm not a cabber. I don't make a lot of other lapidary things. I have a Dremel that's been sitting in, it's not a Dremel, it's a knockoff Dremel. A flex shaft Dremel type machine that's been sitting in a box since I bought it last August for relatively cheap, just because I've been focused on faceting rather than trying to do any Dremel rotary work. Although I have things like opal that I should probably carve up a little bit and work on with that. But I enjoy faceting enough where it's I'm willing to spend the time on that rather than other stuff. And now that I'm saying that, my lesson with Mike was free, but if you have to pay $250 for a course, or I don't make up a number and say $400 for some big course, and maybe once you crunch those numbers, it's actually not that crazy to get one of those cheaper machines with the gem or the cut kit, or do your own modifications if you can. Because if you're spending $500 on your own machine, your own parts, and you have those from the get-go, you can then experiment and see if that's something that you're interested in and want to continue doing for a similar price point, or maybe slightly more than a class would take, but you have then those tools with you at the end of the course, rather than taking the course and then having to go out and, if you learned on a $5,000 machine, I think you're much more likely to want to get that $5,000 machine because they're more familiar and you don't have to relearn how to use the various quirks of a Facetron versus an Ultratech versus a Graves from the 60s, or a Sapphire, or a Gem Masta, or a Polytechnic. There's lots of different varieties out there versus a Raytech Shaw. Like if you go handpiece versus mass, that can solidify your journey from the start. If you spend the $500 or so on the cut kit and you cut a few stones, or even one stone, and you're having a little bit of trouble, but you're making progress, and you can look at resources like YouTube, or maybe then you find someone that is able to facet nearby and you can ask them questions, or a faceting Discord, or another online community of facetors, or the United States Faceting Guild, the Columbia Willamette Faceting Guild, the Midwest Faceting Guild, there's some on the East Coast, there's the Australian and European faceting guilds that you can read newsletters going back with lots of helpful tips. Then you've spent that money on maybe not a great machine, but it's serviceable, and you're making progress in that. And then, I don't know, you can either cut a few stones, or after you have that initial investment, then you can take those laps and the PCD and all the accessories and apply those to a future machine. And so you're not just spending that $500 on something that's going to go to waste. Or you can find out that you don't like it at all, and you can maybe resell it for a little bit of a loss. Huh. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. You found me.
Trust it.
Close it. Okay, bye-bye. Do you want to come up? Okay. Oh, someone's at the door. It's the next day, and I've lost the thread of what we were talking about before. But we are approaching the end stage here. About half an hour left of this fasting process. And there comes a point where I get kind of excited to see like the final product and have the final stone in hand. But it's, you got to be careful about not rushing things to get to the end point, because you can miss something. I talked about my lamp a little bit earlier, and I forgot to mention that the bulb that's in there is an appliance bulb, which is a clear bulb it's a filament bulb that's clear, as opposed to an LED or an opaque bulb. And I had just a regular household light bulb for a long time. I think I switched after a few months of faceting, and because I had heard about the use of the single filament clear bulbs as a better way to look at your stone for inspection. And it is actually, I think, a lot better not for some reason, but because it's a single filament and there's just like that single line of light, you're better able to get the light exactly how you want. Whereas with a big opaque bulb, you have this big mass of white light that can kind of flash across the facet and mask problems. Whereas with a single filament bulb, the single filament of light is a narrow strip of light, and you can actually kind of focus on it in the reflection of the facet to see how well your polish is coming in or where the scratches are in the stone. So if you are using an old bulb or a regular bulb, I would suggest you switch to an appliance bulb. They're only a couple dollars at box stores. I bought an extra one just in case this one that I have goes out, but they last for a long time as well. Although I would actually like a little bit better light setup around the table. I have an overhead. I think it's a cooler LED bulb in an overhead light above the table, which works okay. But I've seen setups by some people where they have like LED lights all around their table. And in one case, I saw someone have kind of an arch of LEDs so that they don't have any shadows at all, which was pretty cool. And so you can inspect your stone from any angle and have a much better look at the stone, whereas sometimes I have to kind of hunch in to see the stone in the light. And I guess that's another thing too, is the ergonomics of my setup is, I don't know, maybe not the best. I hunch anyway, but the way that I facet with the handpiece, like right now I have my hand flat on it, which is a little more ergonomical than the sort of pinching hold that I had earlier. And so that's what I try to do for the most part to ease wrist strain. But you got sort of small repetitive movements with your elbow and shoulder. And so I kind of sit off to the side a little bit, more towards the water tank than the platform when I facet, so that my arm is in a more natural resting position. And a lot of people will take the platform there off of the box that the motor is hidden in, which you can't see because it's under that big metal sheet at the bottom of the screen. But by removing that, you can mount the faceting machine in a table and lower it, more to a sort of the height that a keyboard would be in, 36 inches countertop height, more or less. And that would be a little better in some cases, for faceting stones. But because my situation is a little more mobile and I'm using a really old table that was actually a family heirloom from Morgan's side, it's been in her family for several generations, so I don't think they take too kindly to me cutting out a rectangle to put a machine in there. And it's a leaf table, so it wouldn't really work to cut a hole in it anyway, and it would ruin the functionality of it. But if you're gonna get a machine, if you have a dedicated space, you might want to look into mounting it in a table. And there's that gunk coming up again. I guess I must have been having an issue with a facet or a couple facets and have been trying to look for excuses to why that might be other than skill. It seems like this might be the only podcast audio commentary that I'll be doing, at least for a while, because I'm running out of things to say and I'm covering most of the bases that I can think of for faceting a stone, all the little tips and tricks that I've learned over the years, and I'm probably forgetting many more, but without a list in front of me of what to talk about, it's hard to keep things straight. Like, I think I repeated the thing about the cutting the stone with the saw blade twice. as I was going back and kind of compiling the previously recorded bits. But if you have any other questions about faceting, clearly I'm super excited to talk about it. That's one of the things that I say when people ask me about, cutting a stone, or if I am able to cut stones for them. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm open for commissions, and my time isn't so precious that if you're not going to send me the stone, I don't want to talk to you. It's a hobby that I enjoy, and so if someone wants to talk to me about cutting sunstones, or someone was talking about kunzite most recently, or opal, I'm happy to talk about it, talk about the issues that might come up and how we would go about cutting that. And if they want to send it to someone else, that's fine too. Or if they don't want to cut it at all after the risks are made clear. Like, it's not a risk, but I did a video about faceting math and all of the sort of calculations that you can go into with determining the size of the stone that you're going to get out of a certain piece of rough, depending on the diagram. And now that I have the diagram in front of me, so there's the default GemCut Studio output has facet data, which is all the different facets and tiers in the stone, and then size data, which is all the ratios of the different parts of the stone to one another, so if you're cutting a proportionally correct stone, which is crucial if you have a rectangle that has to be 1.5 times longer than it is wide. But it's also useful if you're estimating how much rough you have left in a stone, like the crown to width height after you cut in your pavilion. On this stone, the crown to width height is 0.161. So if you have a 10 millimeter wide stone, then your crown is going to be 1.6 millimeters. And then you also have to add in a third to a half of a millimeter for the girdle. So your total crown and girdle height is going to be about 2 millimeters. And so that I could have used that to calculate, like, I could cut off 3 millimeters from the top of that, the rod that I started with, and save myself some time. And so I had started, we did a cutaway there because I thought I was done, and then realized that I should probably cut in the table, which is really convenient for the Raytech Shaw or the handpiece fasteners in general. These machines are able to do a table without any adapters or anything. You just set it to a 0 degree straight up and down setting, and you can cut in a table right away. Whereas with the mast machines, you can set that to 0 degrees and move the mast really close to the machine, but there are some issues with potential torque on the machine and the dop and the mast and all that it's generally not advised to do that. Some people do that, that's fine. If you can do it successfully, that's good. But that's why there's table adapters, like the 45 degree table adapters, where you set your angle to 45 degrees, and then the dop, there's a dop adapter that goes into the mast or the quill, and then has a 45 degree angle in there as well, where your dop with the stone goes into the bottom, and then that is perfectly perpendicular to the lap. Ideally, then you have to do some fine adjustments, I'm sure, just like with this machine. And I'm putting my finger on the very end there because I think I was undercutting a little bit or cutting to one side, and so I'm trying to just fix that with a little bit of hand pressure, which is a skill that I've kind of developed over the years, still working on it. But it's one of those things where there's just enough flex in various parts of the machine where you can use a little bit of hand pressure to compensate for slight undercuttings or overcuttings in one direction versus another, to fix slight, I won't say mistakes, but more or less mistakes in probably compounding mistakes from previous slightly missed meets. But now we're done with the copper lap. So we're going to move over to our final stage of polishing at 50,000 grit diamond on tin. And I'm running out of diamond, but I did order some more from Adam Bigelow over with Sunstone Japan. Had some, it's 60,000 grit, I think, so it's basically comparable for a decent price. I could probably go over to Mike's and get some for slightly cheaper, but I figure I gotta find a good source for the future as well. And so I'm willing to give someone else a try to see if they have decently good polishing compound as well. And I trust Adam for his material. Although I haven't worked with him directly or talked to him before this, he has a good reputation in the community. And I heard about him before I talked to Alan, but Alan makes Alan Lindbergh, that I mentioned way back when in this video. He makes cerium oxide laps that is only available through Adam's shop. And it looks like oh yeah, so I guess we'll talk about the faceting itself here. So I am polishing the table first, which I was cutting in from the girdle to the table when I was, cutting in the other stages, but I've read in other diagrams, you generally polish from the table towards the girdle. So kind of the opposite direction, the opposite order. You go from your table and then do the star facets and then the break facets and then the main facets and the break facets. And that way you're able to control the geometry a little bit more, or the shape of the design on the crown. Because by cutting in the table first and then moving to the little star facets around the outside, I can set the table size and shape exactly how I want, and then go and polish the subsequent facets. And sometimes you have to go back and adjust the star facets a little bit. But what you don't want to do is, start at the girdle and then polish, and maybe you have to make a couple of small corrections and you over polish one stage, and then those errors compound until you reach the table, and then all of a sudden your table is, rectangular instead of round, or oblong instead of symmetrical, because you had those slight errors at the beginning that compounded as you worked up the stone. It's better to force the errors in the crown towards the girdle. Just like people won't look at the girdle usually edge on, they're not really going to pay as much attention to where the meats are at the girdle if you overcut them a little bit. Like I have a couple of overcut meats on the girdle here, where instead of coming to a point, they kind of cut down into the girdle more or less. But you would never know until I tell you, or until you take macro photographs to try to sell it on Etsy, because then all the little mistakes pop out at you. So the better your photographs are, the more highlighted your mistakes will be. And I try not to hide anything in my photographs, but I also can't take super high quality photographs because I'm just using my phone. But I think there's a trade-off there, because the way that it looks in my phone is actually a little more natural than if you had the stone set up in a light box and took it with a 100mm macro lens with your Canon DSLR with perfect lighting conditions and the stone looks gorgeous, but it's not going to look like that in a ring or on your finger. It'll still look good because if you're willing to put all that effort into photographing the stone, I'm sure it's cut really nicely and will perform well. But you're rarely going to see that perfect lighting condition anywhere. But it does help sell the stones because people see those beautiful photos and they're like, yeah, I want that. Whereas they see my photographs of dust speckled gemstones and they're like, oh, I'm sure there's something like, well, if they can't take a good photo, then I'm sure the stone isn't that good either. If you've been watching how I'm polishing this, I still have that same hand grip and only have it on the lap for a very short amount of time. But with the polishing, the table went in pretty quickly, as you saw, and then the C4 facets, those little star facets around the table, those are going to come in really quickly too, where especially the little nubby ones, those were barely a touchdown on the lap. And generally I try to sweep the pan piece across the lap. But if I'm just doing one of those very small, millimeter to 2 millimeter wide facets, then I will just put it down on the same place in the lap, just in case there's a little bit of height difference in the center versus the outside rim of the lap, just so I don't overcut it by having too much pressure on because I hit a high spot or something. I'm not sure if we're at the 20. I'm not sure if we're at the 20-degree stage. Looks like we could be. It's, as you can hear, it's kind of squeaky. But it's really straightforward. I've got the diamond on there. I'm putting the stone on the lap, sweeping it across a few times, maybe speeding up the lap every now and then. Not for a small facet, but for the big ones I do that. And then we're adjusting. So maybe now we're at 20 or 26, I'm not sure. But yeah, it's a very repetitive process, and repetition is kind of the key to moving along and working on cutting time here and there. Oh, and so my little hand loop there, the 10 times loop that I have is a Belomo triplet 10 times magnifier hand lens that I've had since undergraduate, or since I was an undergrad in geology. We bought those on bulk for the members of the undergrad in my year, and I think it was really cheap, maybe $10 or $20, because we bought it in bulk, and it's lasted me. That was 2000, the late 2000s, so it's pretty old. It's almost 20 years old now. And there might be a couple of small either chips or issues with it, but it still works great. I guess I heard one, maybe YouTube, or not YouTube forum, some community forum post about how those can chip easily. Maybe the new ones do, but you get an old stock one and they're pretty beefy. And the triplet is good. You can get a cheaper 10 times magnifier, but the triplet reduces distortion and I think helps with eye strain a little bit too, because you're looking at it more naturally as opposed to having it kind of warped and brought closer in a weird way. I don't know. I haven't really used any other 10 times loops to compare against, but I've heard the triplets are good and better to use than the doublets or the singlets if they make those. And I don't know why I stopped the video. Maybe I coughed. Maybe I needed to cough or have a drink or something. So if you're interested in faceting, a 10 times loop is, I think, the best way to go. Well, that's the best way for me to go, partly because I had one already. And I was familiar with its use, and you bring it to your eye and then bring the stone closer to the loop rather than putting the loop up by the stone and then trying to bring the whole thing up to your eye or something. But you need you need a surprising amount of accessories for faceting. Like, I bought my machine, but then I realized I needed to get an alcohol lamp and dop wax, and I go through a lot of paper towels, and then I needed to get more laps and the copper lap and the PCD diamond, and set up a drip system because it didn't come with not that it needed to, but they don't come with waste tanks, so you got to set up something for the water to drip into. And I don't know that I've ever shown it, but my waste tank is an old gallon jug of milk from Costco, so it's one of those kind of boxy milk jugs, and that I broke a hole in the cap in the top and just feed the tube down in there a little bit, and that holds more than one stone's worth of water. Although sometimes I don't know, I empty it out as needed, more or less, but I've never had a problem with it overflowing, although I've come pretty close once where I totally forgot about it for a while. But my main issue with drainage has only been when the splash pan there, which is what the lap kind of sits in and protects, from water spraying everywhere, that gets a lot of swarf debris in the bottom. And every once in a while, that can clog the drain tube near the top. And so you got to be cognizant that your splash pan is actually draining. I don't think I've ever overflowed it, but I've come really close once where it was almost going to overflow into the the main arbor of the machine, kind of what the lap sets on. So that would have been bad, because then it might have gotten down into the motor or the electricals and caused more issues that I don't need. So if you're like me and you don't clean your splash pan religiously, then you got to be aware of when it's starting to clog. So I'll check it after every time I switch a lap. I usually don't cut too much where I'd have to worry about it during a lap. But if I'm starting to build up, then you got to keep an eye on it. But fortunately, you can see down inside the splash pan if you pull it aside just a little bit. And then I keep another jug of water on the table just to refill the water periodically. And I used one time distilled water and realized very quickly that was going to cost me way too much money to keep pure water on hand to facet, because I would run through a gallon in a stone or two, and I just didn't want to have that much DI water on hand. But also, I used that jug as my water jug for a little while. And then one day, the plastic just broke for some reason. Like there was a small dent, and over time, that weakened enough to break the plastic. So use a thicker plastic jug as your waste jug. I've seen old soda bottles, like the 2 liter soda bottles, be used for waste bottles before. But I found the Costco, you know, the Costco gallon milk jugs, since they're kind of square, they're a little more structurally sound, and they're maybe a little bit beefier than some of the other plastic jugs that are out there. So that's what I've found works for me. And as we were talking about that, it looks like we're close to done. I don't know what the next clip is because I can't see it on the preview here, but I'm doing a cursory look and spinning the lap dry, so it looks like we're all done. Huh. How about that? That time just flew by, huh? Like, oh, look, there's the stone. Yep. Okay, so now we're on the other side of where the camera just was. The camera was sitting on my little rough storage bin there as we were faceting. But on the left side where the pill bottle is, that's my acetone jar that seals just enough to where the acetone, it does escape, but very slowly, so it lasts a while. I do have a glass jar that I've used for acetone in the past, but I'm worried about dropping the stone onto the glass and chipping it. So I don't use that too much. And we got the alcohol lamp, and then there's a scale on the front there. We're going to heat up the dop and loosen the wax, and then just kind of scrape it off of the loosened wax. And it comes away relatively clean sometimes. I like to try to avoid putting wax into the acetone because then that creates a acetone wax bath that can redeposit wax onto the stone and kind of defeats the purpose of cleaning it. And I think I'll try to show it here in camera. It's not going to look as good right off the dop because there's going to be wax on the bottom killing the light play on the inside. It cools down relatively quickly. Sometimes I'll put it on my little metal transfer jig to cool it down a little quicker before I put it in the water, because you don't want to heat up the stone to loosen it from the wax and then immediately drop it in acetone, because depending on the stone, it could explode or crack if there's a slight, veil on the inside or inclusions or something that are heated up. You don't want to get all that way and then rush at the last second and have it explode. So we'll leave it in a little bit of acetone for a while and come back. And we're back. So the stone, sometimes the stones disappear inside the jar there because of the refractive index and the way that the color is. But it's a nice purple from the side. That's a good sign. One of the things I like is as you're faceting sometimes, as you start polishing, you'll see the dispersion start to come in and the fire in the stone, even while you're just polishing and cutting the stone. And so we're seeing the stone at the same time together for the first time. Completed. Very bright. I have not an open window, but I have a window right over my left shoulder. And there's a little bit of kind of like orangey, pinky look in the middle there that I was worried was windowing at first, but that's my fingers holding the stone, the reflection of my fingers on the stone, because the way that the light was bouncing around on the inside. I think it might be still a little bit dirty here, and I was waving my finger behind it just to check and see if there was windowing, and I didn't really see any movement of my finger behind the stone, so I was like, okay, it's not I didn't window it, that's good. Because even though GemCut Studio said the critical angle was 33, I was like, well, I did 36. Is that far enough away to avoid windowing? But there we go. There, it's a little bit cleaned off now. Still got our trademark lint piece on there, a little fabric bit. But you can see some color, like blues and purples, come in from the fire of the dispersion. And we're going to weigh it here. And it's about 9 millimeters, and it's 4.115 carats. And there you go. This day was overcast when I was trying to get a video of it, so the top half of the stone kind of gets pure whited out. I was trying to find a way to show it off. But we'll have some sunny photo videos in the subsequent stages here. But the stone, that's one of the wild things that I found about gemstones, is they look totally different in different lighting in some cases, where like in the shadow this stone kind of glows, and in the sunlight it sparkles, so you get the best of both worlds. You can see it's overcast in the background there. I'm trying to orient it so the glaring white sky doesn't mask all the color and sparkle in the stone. And like I said, the stone is okay. It has a little bit of sparkle. It has a surprising amount of like really small flashes of light. I guess just the way that the geometry of my facets was. And there are some, it has kind of an interesting, I think, light play on the surface with the facets, where because everything's not meat point, there's kind of some chunkier bits and some finer bits, and so there's a lot of maybe visual interest depending on how you look at it, or maybe you don't like it at all. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like and subscribe. Ring that bell. Go to Patreon. Buy my stones. Give me money. And I hope you enjoyed this. We're almost done. And here we are inside on a sunny day. And yeah, we're just going to look at the stone for a few minutes. Hope you enjoyed this. It was fun overall. And yeah, in shadow, you just kind of get that purpley glow. Okay, so now it's sunny. We're going to get some sparkles here. Not much else to say other than look at the sparkly gemstone. Isn't it pretty? I like sparkles. And yeah, this is why I can't do an unboxing video. But I can clearly talk about faceting for a while with a few breaks, but I like it. Who knows if I'll cut the stone again, or this design again. This might be the only one in existence. But let me know if you cut it.